There exists a place in the heart of colonial America where history and mystery intertwine in ways that defy conventional explanation. This is not a tale of fiction, nor is it a mere legend whispered around candlelight. What you're about to hear is the documented history of a mansion, a sprawling estate built upon foundations of unimaginable human suffering, wealth accumulated through the enslavement of thousands, and secrets so dark that even time itself seems unwilling to reveal them completely. For over 170 years, this mansion has stood as a monument to contradiction. From the outside, it appears as a testament to architectural grandeur and colonial opulence. But those who have ventured beyond its ornate gates speak of something profoundly different. They speak of presences in empty corridors, of voices echoing from locked chambers, of inexplicable phenomena that occur when the sun descends below the horizon. The walls remember, the stones remember, and perhaps most disturbingly, the spirits of those who are bound within these spaces remember as well. This is the story of the Mansion of the Restless Dead, a chronicle of human ambition, moral corruption, and the price that one family paid for their unbridled cruelty. It is a story that begins with splendor and descends into darkness, ultimately revealing that some debts can never be fully paid, no matter how much time passes. What truly happened between these walls? Why did an entire dynasty crumble into madness and ruin? And what exactly continues to walk the corridors of this estate in the dead of night? Stay with us as we uncover the answers to questions that history itself has tried to bury. In the year of 1742, in the fertile valleys of what was then New Granada, a family of Portuguese merchants named the Cipriano arrived with ambitions as vast as the Atlantic Ocean they had crossed. The patriarch, Don Gaspar Velázquez Cipriano, was a man of sharp intellect and sharper instincts, traits that would serve him extraordinarily well in the brutal machinery of colonial commerce. Don Gaspar did not come to these lands empty-handed. He arrived with capital, connections, and most importantly, with the documented right to establish a vast agricultural estate. He surveyed the rolling hillsides, the abundant water sources, the rich earth that seemed almost designed by Providence itself for cultivation. He saw potential where others saw wilderness, and in that potential he envisioned not merely a farm, but a dynasty. The location he selected was strategic, positioned along a tributary that led to major trading routes. His future estate would have unparalleled access to ports and markets. The climate was ideal for the cultivation of sugarcane, indigo, and cacao, crops that commanded extraordinary prices in the markets of Seville and Lisbon. All that was needed was one essential commodity: labor. By 1745, construction of the hacienda began. What rose from the earth over the following 8 years was nothing short of architectural audacity. The main mansion featured 3 stories of imported stone, quarried and shipped at tremendous expense from Portugal itself. The facade bore the intricate carvings and Baroque flourishes that announced to all who approached that this was the residence of not merely a wealthy man, but a man of consequence and taste. The interior was equally breathtaking. Grand staircases of mahogany curved upward like frozen dancers. Chandeliers of Venetian crystal reflected candlelight across frescoed ceilings, depicting pastoral scenes of Arcadian beauty. Scenes that stood in grotesque contrast to the reality occurring mere feet away. The library contained volumes in 4 languages, acquired from the great centers of European learning. The dining hall could accommodate 100 guests for celebrations that would last until dawn. But this splendor was not born from genius or innovation. It was born from a calculation of remarkable cruelty. The labor force that Don Gaspar assembled numbered in the thousands. Between the years of 1745 and 1755, over 4,000 enslaved African men, women, and children were brought to the Cipriano hacienda. They arrived in chains, their eyes hollow with the trauma of capture and the hellish journey across the Atlantic. Many did not survive their first month in these tropical lands. The mortality rate in the early years exceeded 30% annually. The plantation itself sprawled across 30,000 acres. The working areas were organized with the precision of a military operation. The sugar mill, powered by enslaved labor, and the few animals that could survive in the climate, operated nearly ceaselessly. The indigo vats stained the earth, and the hands of workers a deep blue that would not wash away. The cacao fields extended toward the horizon, requiring constant maintenance, constant harvesting, constant human effort. And at the center of all this lay the mansion, pristine and white, presiding over the suffering with the inevitability of a cathedral. The wealth generated by the Cipriano hacienda became legendary throughout the colonies. Don Gaspar's correspondence with crown officials was filled with reports of yields that seemed almost impossible, records that surpassed those of rival estates by factors that aroused both admiration and suspicion. How was such production sustained? What was the secret to such relentless productivity? The secret, as always, was simpler and more terrible than any mystery. It was sustained through relentless, methodical brutality. The enslaved people who labored on the Cipriano hacienda were subjected to conditions that, even in an era of systematic cruelty, were noted as exceptional in their harshness. The work days extended from before dawn to well after dusk. The food rations were calculated to provide minimal sustenance, enough to prevent immediate collapse, but not enough to provide strength or hope. The punishments for any infraction, real or imagined, were swift and severe. The overseer during this period was a man named Rodrigo Mendes, a Brazilian-born administrator with a reputation for extracting maximum output through intimidation and violence. Contemporary accounts describe him as a figure of nightmare proportions, a man who seemed to take genuine pleasure in the infliction of pain, who viewed each enslaved person not as human, but as a commodity to be used until exhaustion, then replaced. Don Gaspar himself remained largely removed from the daily machinery of this suffering. His role was that of the calculating businessman who signed documents, received reports, and watched his wealth multiply. There is a portrait of him that hangs in a museum in Bogotá, painted in 1750 when he was at the height of his power. He is depicted in profile, dressed in the finest silks, his hand resting upon a globe, his expression conveying absolute certainty in his own righteousness. One could stare at that portrait for hours and never perceive in it the slightest hint of doubt, of conscience, of humanity. But if the portrait does not reveal it, the historical record does. The correspondence that has survived shows a man increasingly consumed by the accumulation of wealth, increasingly isolated from conventional society due to the very methods that generated his fortune. His letters to relatives in Portugal grow more erratic, more defensive, more obsessed with justifications for practices that, even in the colonial context, were approaching the limits of the acceptable. By the 1750s, the Cipriano hacienda had become not merely a place of production, but a place of terror. The enslaved population had grown to over 7,000 individuals. The escape attempts were relentless, the rebellion plots were constant, and the response from Don Gaspar and his administrators grew increasingly severe. It was in this context of escalating tension, of a system stretched to breaking point through human desperation and human cruelty, that the foundations of what would eventually become known as the Mansion of the Restless Dead were truly laid. Not the stone foundations, which were impressive but mundane, but the spiritual foundations, built from the anguish of thousands, consecrated by blood and tears, sanctified by injustice that would echo forward through centuries. The mansion rose into the sky, beautiful and terrible, a monument to human ambition and human darkness, and in rising it accumulated something beyond mere architectural grandeur. It accumulated a debt written not in account books, but in human suffering, a debt that, as we shall see, would eventually demand payment in the most unexpected and most terrifying ways imaginable. What distinguished the Cipriano hacienda from other estates of its era was not merely the scale of its operations, but the deliberate architectural design that facilitated the systematic dehumanization of its enslaved population. The mansion itself, in its grandeur and elegance, served as a mask, and beneath that mask, quite literally beneath the graceful floors of the salons and the refined spaces where the Cipriano family entertained distinguished guests, lay a world of profound horror. The substructure of the mansion was extensive. What appeared from the exterior as a three-story building was, in reality, a four-story structure, the fourth level being a basement complex that extended far deeper than would be necessary for simple storage. These underground spaces were accessed through hidden passages, concealed doors, and stairways that descended into darkness with a finality that felt almost bottomless. This was the domain of the enslaved people who served within the mansion itself: the cooks, the cleaners, the washerwomen, the guards, and those unfortunate souls designated for the most degrading purposes. Contemporary accounts, preserved in the journals of a Jesuit priest named Father Miguel de Santana, who visited the estate in 1758, described these spaces with a horror that even ecclesiastical training could not entirely suppress. The dungeons, for they were nothing less than dungeons, were arranged in a series of chambers branching from a central corridor. Some were fitted with iron rings and chains, explicitly designed as punishment cells. Others were merely dark rooms, their walls slick with perpetual dampness, their air thick with the accumulated miasma of human suffering and bodily function. There was no sanitation. There was minimal light. The temperature in these chambers remained constant throughout the year, perpetually cold, perpetually damp, perpetually hospitable to disease. Father Miguel's account notes that he descended into these spaces only once, despite Don Gaspar's insistence that he inspect them. The priest emerged visibly shaken, and his subsequent letter to his superiors in Cartagena is one of the most damning documents in the historical record. He wrote, "What I witnessed in those depths was not civilization, but rather the very architecture of perdition. I have prayed extensively regarding what I observed, and I confess that my faith itself has been tested by the knowledge that Christian men could construct and maintain such places. The uses to which these chambers were put were varied and systematic. Some were punishment cells, where enslaved people were confined in chains for infractions that ranged from insufficient work output to the crime of attempting to escape. The standard punishment for attempted escape was 1 month of confinement in these cells, emerging only briefly to receive minimal rations. Many emerged with permanent injuries from the shackles. Many did not emerge at all. Other chambers served darker purposes still. There were spaces designated for the confinement of women, separate from the men, where additional horrors occurred that the historical record is circumspect in describing, but which can be inferred from the notation "special purposes" in the administrative ledgers. The women confined in these spaces faced not only the brutality that all enslaved people experienced, but the additional brutality of sexual violence perpetrated by the overseers and by Don Gaspar himself. There is, in the Colombian National Archives, a document dated 1757 that lists the names of enslaved children born on the hacienda during that year. 73 children are listed. Next to each name is a notation of their parentage. In almost every case, the father's name corresponds to a European or European-descended man, while the mother's name is one of the enslaved African women. These notations are clinical, almost casual, revealing the utterly systematic nature of the sexual violence that occurred within the hacienda complex. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these subterranean spaces was their use for what can only be described as human experimentation. The Cipriano hacienda, remote as it was, attracted not merely administrators and overseers, but also men of what we might charitably call scientific curiosity, physicians, naturalists, and intellectuals who came to observe and to experiment upon the enslaved population with a freedom that they could never exercise in more established European communities. One such figure was Dr. Baltasar Fonseca, a naturalist from Seville who spent the years from 1756 to 1759 at the hacienda, ostensibly documenting tropical flora and fauna, but who was actually conducting experiments on enslaved people in the depths of the basement. His journals, discovered in a private collection in Madrid in the 1990s, describe attempts to measure pain tolerance across different racial categories to determine which groups were more susceptible to tropical diseases, and other investigations that read more like the notebooks of a monster than a scientist. One passage from Fonseca's journal, dated March 1758, describes the systematic infection of enslaved people with tropical fevers in order to observe the progression of the disease. He notes with clinical precision the death of a woman he identifies only as Subject 47 and records his observations regarding her final hours with a detachment that is deeply sickening even to read nearly 3 centuries later. These basements, then, were not merely places of confinement and punishment. They were places where the very concept of human dignity was obliterated, where enslaved people were treated as experimental subjects, as property, as something less than human in ways that extended far beyond the brutality of the labor system itself. And it was in these spaces that something began to change. The workers who labored within the mansion, those who descended into those depths daily, or who were confined within them as punishment, or who witnessed the horrors that transpired there, these people began to speak of something that the historical record, sparse as it is, can only describe as disturbances. In 1759, there is a letter from the overseer Rodrigo Mendez to Don Gaspar complaining of difficulties in managing the enslaved population, citing what he describes as a pervasive spirit of rebelliousness and a seeming loss of fear amongst even those who have been most severely disciplined. He notes that several workers claim to have witnessed visions and spectral visitations in the depths of the basement chambers. Mendez is dismissive of such claims, attributing them to the mental deterioration that results from confinement. But his very inclusion of this complaint in an official letter suggests that the matter was serious enough to warrant documentation. By 1760, the frequency of such reports had increased. Multiple accounts from overseers describe enslaved people, particularly those recently imprisoned in the basement chambers, exhibiting behavior that was described as touched by madness or visited by demons. Some of these people reported experiencing visions of their ancestors. Others spoke of voices that emerged from the walls themselves, speaking in languages that no European present could recognize, but which the enslaved people identified as the languages of their homelands and their dead. The response from the hacienda administration was characteristically brutal. Those who reported such experiences were subjected to additional punishment on the assumption that they were malingering or attempting to evade work through false claims of supernatural disturbance. Several people were whipped, shackled for extended periods, or in one documented case, subjected to forms of torture designed to drive out the demons that were supposedly possessing them. But the strange occurrences did not stop. Instead, they intensified. In 1762, a fire broke out in one of the basement chambers. The official record claims it was accidental, caused by an overturned candle. But the circumstances were strange. The chamber in question was one designated for the most severe punishments, a small isolated room with only one entrance and no ventilation. A worker named Thomas, who had been confined in an adjacent chamber, reported that he heard singing in a language he did not understand immediately before the fire started. He claimed that the singing seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, and that it possessed a quality that was simultaneously beautiful and deeply terrifying. 8 people died in that fire, including Dr. Fonseca, who had been conducting one of his investigations in the basement at the time. The deaths were significant enough that the Crown sent an official investigator to examine the circumstances. The investigator's report, preserved in the archives, notes irregularities in the physical evidence that suggested the fire's origin was not where the Hacienda authorities claimed it to be. After the death of Dr. Fonseca and the 7 enslaved people who perished with him, something shifted in the testimonies and accounts that emerged from the Hacienda. The enslaved people who worked within the mansion began to speak with increasing frequency and specificity of supernatural presences in the basement chambers. These presences were not described as generic demons or spirits, but as ancestors, as the deceased enslaved people who had died in those chambers and who, according to the beliefs of the African religions that persisted among the enslaved population, despite intense efforts to suppress them, had not been properly honored or allowed to rest. There are accounts from this period describing rituals being conducted in secret, in the deepest parts of the basement, in which the living attempted to communicate with and honor the dead. These rituals were conducted in defiance of the Hacienda authorities and in violation of the laws of the Spanish Crown, which strictly forbade the practice of non-Christian religions. It was during this period that the basement chambers of the Cipriano mansion began to acquire the reputation that would persist into modern times. The reputation of being a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had become permeable, where the suffering of centuries seemed to have worn the veil between worlds thin enough to tear. Now, as you listen to this account, you may be asking yourself, are we to understand these accounts as literal supernatural phenomena, or as the psychological responses of profoundly traumatized people to circumstances of unimaginable cruelty? This is a question that historians and scholars have debated extensively. What can be said with certainty is that something was occurring in those basement chambers that was significant enough to be documented by administrators, that was meaningful enough to the enslaved population to motivate resistance and ritual, and that was disturbing enough to the official representatives of the Crown to warrant investigation. The basement chambers of the Mansion of the Restless Dead had become a place where something fundamental was breaking. Not merely the bodies and minds of the enslaved people confined there, but something more metaphysical, something that the people of that era, regardless of their cultural or religious background, understood as the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. What do you think happened in those depths? What explanation do you find most convincing? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know whether you believe we are witnessing the documentation of literal, supernatural phenomena or the testimony of traumatized people desperately seeking meaning in circumstances of absolute horror. Do you think these explanations are mutually exclusive or can both be true simultaneously? By 1765, the situation on the Cipriano Hacienda had become untenable even by the standards of colonial cruelty. The enslaved population, numbering nearly 10,000 individuals, existed in a state of perpetual tension that made the estate resemble less a productive agricultural operation and more an armed camp perpetually on the brink of explosion. The immediate cause of this escalating tension was straightforward and economic. Don Gaspar had dramatically increased production quotas without increasing rations or reducing work hours. He had also begun a policy of selling off enslaved workers to other estates with increasing frequency, breaking families and communities with a callousness that went beyond even the standard brutality of the system. Additionally, The death rate from disease, malnutrition and overwork had reached such levels that the hacienda was operating at the edge of sustainability, with constant shipments of newly captured African people required simply to maintain the workforce. The response from the enslaved population was not immediate, but when it came, it was coordinated and sophisticated in ways that the hacienda authorities had not anticipated. The rebellion was organized through the network of secret religious practices that persisted in the depths of the hacienda complex. It drew on knowledge of guerrilla warfare transmitted through family lines from warfare in Africa. It incorporated understanding of the hacienda's geography and supply lines, developed through years of labor and confinement. And it was led by a man whose name has been preserved in historical records and whose legacy has acquired an almost mythical quality over the centuries. His name was Kwame, and he had been brought to the hacienda in 1748 at the age of 16, part of a shipment of captive people from the region of modern-day Ghana. Unlike many who did not survive the first years, Kwame not only survived, but acquired over the course of nearly 2 decades a detailed knowledge of the hacienda's operations and politics. He learned the Spanish language and Portuguese as well. He proved capable enough that he was eventually assigned to work as a translator and intermediary between the European administrators and the enslaved population, a position that provided him with unprecedented access to information about the estate's operations and vulnerabilities. Kwame was recognized by those around him as possessing qualities of leadership and spiritual authority. The enslaved people on the hacienda came to regard him as a connection to the African homelands they had lost, a repository of knowledge regarding the religious and cultural traditions that the hacienda authorities sought to suppress. In the secret gatherings in the basement chambers and in hidden clearings at the periphery of the hacienda lands, Kwame assumed the role of both spiritual guide and strategist. The rebellion began on the night of November 18, 1765, and it unfolded with a coordination that suggests extensive planning. The initial phase focused on securing the hacienda's weaponry and disabling the oversight capabilities of the European authorities. A group of enslaved workers who had been assigned to the hacienda armory seized control of it, distributing weapons to others who had been positioned strategically throughout the estate. Nearly simultaneously, the plantation's administrators and overseers were killed, not in frenzy, but with a deliberate efficiency that suggests careful prior planning of targets and tactics. Don Gaspar himself was killed in his bed by assassins who accessed the mansion through passages that only someone with intimate knowledge of its architecture could have navigated. It is a striking testament to the efficiency of the rebellion that the most powerful man on the estate, surrounded by guards and servants in a location of apparent security, was unable to mount any meaningful resistance. By dawn, the hacienda authorities had effectively ceased to exist. What followed was approximately 4 months of liberated territory. The enslaved people who had seized control of the hacienda did not flee or burn the estate, as the authorities might have feared. Instead, under Kwame's leadership, they reorganized the estate's operations for their own benefit. The brutal work quotas were abolished. The food distribution system was restructured to ensure that sustenance was allocated equitably to all members of the community, not merely to those deemed productive by the standards of the enslaving system. The religious practices that had been conducted in secret in the basement chambers were brought into daylight. The hacienda's chapel, which had been forced upon the enslaved population as a symbol of Christian conversion and European supremacy, was reconsecrated according to African religious traditions. The basement chambers themselves were symbolically transformed through rituals that were designed to honor the dead who had suffered and perished there. Contemporaneous accounts from outside observers primarily from priests and Spanish colonial officials who were attempting to assess the situation, described the liberated hacienda with a mixture of astonishment and discomfort. One official report notes that the freed people had organized themselves with remarkable order and purpose, that they had restored the agricultural operations to productive capacity, and that they conducted themselves with dignity and purposefulness that was most unexpected from people so recently subjected to enslavement. But the colonial authorities could not allow this situation to persist. The liberation of a hacienda and the establishment of a self-governed community of formerly enslaved people represented an existential threat to the entire colonial system. If other enslaved people learned that rebellion could succeed, that the hacienda could be seized and reorganized for the benefit of the enslaved rather than the enslavers, the entire apparatus of colonial slavery would be threatened. The response was military. In March of 1766, a force of colonial militia, numbering approximately 500 soldiers, advanced on the Cipriano hacienda. Kwame and the leadership of the liberated community prepared to resist, but they were severely outmatched in military capacity. What ensued was not a battle in the traditional sense, but rather a systematic military operation designed to restore control and to inflict catastrophic punishment on those who had dared to rebel. The colonial forces surrounded the hacienda and laid siege. They cut off supply lines and prevented the liberated community from receiving additional resources or support from surrounding sympathizers. The siege lasted for 3 weeks. During this time, Kwame attempted to negotiate, but the colonial authorities made clear that their only objective was the unconditional surrender of those responsible for the rebellion and the re-establishment of total control over the enslaved population. On the night of March 28, 1766, Kwame made a decision that would ensure his place in both historical record and in the collective memory of the enslaved people on the hacienda and beyond. He led a group of approximately 200 fighters in a final assault on the colonial forces, knowing with certainty that this assault could not succeed militarily, but would give the remainder of the liberated community time to attempt to disperse and escape into the forests and mountains surrounding the hacienda. The assault was slaughter. The colonial forces, prepared and militarily superior, systematically annihilated Kwame's forces. Contemporary accounts describe the carnage with a clinical coldness that barely conceals the magnitude of the killing. Kwame himself was killed in the assault, though accounts differ regarding the exact circumstances. Some records suggest he was killed in direct combat with colonial soldiers. Others claim that he was captured and executed. With Kwame's death and the destruction of the rebellion's leadership, organized resistance on the hacienda collapsed. Many of the remaining liberated people attempted to escape into the surrounding territories. Others were recaptured by colonial forces. Still others retreated into the basement chambers of the mansion itself, where they attempted to mount a final defense. What happened in those basement chambers in the final days of the liberation is documented only in fragmentary form, in the reports of colonial officers, and in the oral traditions preserved in the communities of formerly enslaved people and their descendants. But the combined testimony suggests a final tragedy of staggering proportions. The colonial forces, determined to completely suppress the rebellion and to restore total control over the hacienda, systematized the killing with a brutality that even exceeded the standards of colonial military operations. Many of the enslaved people who had retreated into the basement chambers were killed where they were found. Others chose to end their own lives rather than face recapture and reprisals. Some historical accounts suggest that approximately 300 people perished in those basement chambers in the final weeks of the suppression of the rebellion, a death toll that, while small in comparison to the overall casualties of colonial violence, was concentrated in a relatively small geographical area and created a location saturated with death and trauma to an extraordinary degree. Among the dead was Kwame himself. His body, along with those of other rebellion leaders, was displayed in the hacienda courtyard as a warning to any who might consider further rebellion. The degradation of his corpse continued for days until colonial authorities, fearing that the martyrdom was creating sympathy for the rebellion rather than suppressing it, finally ordered the bodies removed and disposed of in unmarked graves in the forest beyond the hacienda compound. In the aftermath of the rebellion's suppression, the hacienda was reorganized under intensified control. The colonial authorities installed a military garrison directly on the property. The enslaved population was subjected to punishments of shocking severity designed to ensure that any thought of further rebellion would be immediately suppressed by fear. Those who had participated in the rebellion, even in minor capacities, were tracked down, captured, and executed with public ceremonies designed to serve as spectacles of terror. The basement chambers, the site of so much suffering and death during the rebellion, were sealed. Officially, this was to prevent the spread of disease. But in the accounts preserved in oral tradition and in the fragmentary documents that remain, there is a persistent assertion that the sealing of the chambers was motivated by something more, by the conviction of both the colonial authorities and the enslaved people that something had fundamentally changed about those spaces, that they had become places where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead had been torn permanently open. The years immediately following the rebellion saw an extraordinary outbreak of what were documented as supernatural phenomena on the hacienda. Multiple accounts describe sounds in the sealed basement chambers, sounds that were characterized as screaming, singing, or voices speaking in languages that no living person present could recognize or understand. Workers assigned to various tasks reported witnessing apparitions. Several workers, terrified by these phenomena, fled the hacienda and refused to return. Don Gaspar's widow, Doña Maria Cristina, attempted to rehabilitate the hacienda's reputation and operations. She hired a new administrator, rebuilt the production system, and sought to restore the estate to its former prosperity, but she was unsuccessful. The hacienda's productivity, which had been extraordinary under Don Gaspar's brutal regime, never recovered to its former levels. Workers who could flee did so. New workers arriving from Africa seemed reluctant to remain for extended periods, and a persistent reputation began to form, a reputation that the hacienda, and particularly the sealed basement chambers within the mansion, was a place where the consequences of human cruelty had created something that exceeded the conventional understanding of the natural world. By 1780, the Cipriano Hacienda, once considered one of the most productive estates in all the colonies, was in decline. The wealth that had been accumulated through decades of slavery-driven agricultural production was being steadily eroded by decreasing productivity, by the costs of maintaining the military garrison, and by the expenses associated with managing an increasingly unstable, enslaved population. I must pause here to acknowledge the weight of what we have discussed thus far. We have traced a story that moves from incredible opulence to incredible brutality, from human ambition to human tragedy, from liberation to suppression, and from the ordinary world into something that begins to approach the extraordinary. The enslaved people who lived and died on this hacienda, who resisted their enslavement, who rebelled and were crushed, who may or may not have haunted the places of their suffering, they deserve to be honored with our acknowledgement that they were human beings of remarkable courage, resilience, and dignity, confronted by a system of evil that was systematic, that was legal, that was normalized by the society that created it. I thank you for remaining with me through this darkness. I know that what we are hearing is difficult, that it challenges us to confront the reality of historical cruelty in ways that are uncomfortable and disturbing. But this confrontation is necessary. The knowledge that such things occurred is essential to understanding who we are as human beings, what we are capable of, and what we must vigilantly resist in our own times. The best is yet to come. What follows are the supernatural consequences of this history, the manifestations that have persisted into the modern era, and the attempts to understand and document phenomena that may represent something unprecedented in our understanding of reality itself. The years following the suppression of Kwame's rebellion marked a fundamental shift in the trajectory of the Cipriano family. What had been, from 1742 through 1765, an epoch of extraordinary wealth accumulation and social ascendancy would be followed by a period of decline, instability, and tragedy that would stretch across generations. Doña Maria Cristina, Don Gaspar's widow, inherited not merely an estate but a burden whose psychological and spiritual dimensions far exceeded its economic implications. The woman who had presided over the hacienda during the rebellion, who had witnessed the violent death of her husband and the destruction of the slave-driven prosperity that had supported their family's status, was left to manage an increasingly difficult situation with resources that, while still substantial by conventional standards, were insufficient to address the fundamental problems facing the estate. Historical records indicate that Doña Maria Cristina suffered what would now be recognized as severe trauma and depression in the decades following the rebellion. Her correspondence from this period, preserved in archives in Seville, reveals a woman increasingly preoccupied with religious matters, increasingly convinced that her family was subject to divine punishment for the brutality inflicted by her late husband. She would never remarry, despite receiving multiple proposals from men of considerable status and wealth. Instead, she devoted herself to pious activities, making substantial donations to the church and establishing convents in the cities of Cartagena and Santa Fe. In correspondence with a bishop, she refers to herself as the widow of the oppressor, and speaks of her life as dedicated to attempting to atone for the sins of my late husband, which have been written in blood upon the very stones of our hacienda. Her son, Diego Velázquez Cipriano, inherited the hacienda at the age of 23 in 1788, following his mother's death. Unlike his father, Diego appears to have lacked both the business acumen and the emotional detachment necessary to manage the estate effectively. Where Don Gaspar had been ruthlessly practical in his application of cruelty to maximize profit, Diego seemed almost paralyzed by ambivalence. He continued the system of slavery because it was the legal and economic foundation of the colony, but he did so with apparent reluctance and with increasingly elaborate justifications. He ordered investigations into the disturbances reported from the basement chambers, hiring engineers and natural philosophers to attempt to explain the phenomena through rational means. One engineer, commissioned in 1790, issued a report suggesting that the sounds emanating from the sealed chambers were the result of underground water flows and air currents creating acoustic phenomena. The report was thorough and technically competent, but it ultimately satisfied no one, neither those who worked on the hacienda and continued to report supernatural visitations, nor Diego himself, who seemed unconvinced by the engineering explanations despite commissioning them. Diego began to drink heavily. By 1795, his behavior had become erratic enough that his wife, Doña Francisca de Mendoza, felt compelled to remove herself and the children to Santa Fe, where they lived in the family's town residence, while Diego remained on the hacienda. Contemporaneous accounts describe Diego as a man obsessed, spending long hours in the library of the mansion studying works on theology, philosophy, and the occult, apparently searching for some framework that could explain the phenomena occurring within the estate. The health of the hacienda's enslaved population deteriorated further during Diego's management. Without the relentless but systematized brutality of his father's era, without clear direction regarding production and profit quotas, the estate fell into a kind of chaos. The workforce, increasingly aware that the hacienda's prosperity was fading and that the authority structure was unstable, became increasingly resistant to the labor demands placed upon them. Several escape attempts occurred, and several were successful. The production of sugar and indigo continued, but at levels substantially below the estate's historical peak. But the most significant deterioration was occurring at a level that had little to do with agriculture or economics. It was occurring in Diego's mind and in the atmosphere of the hacienda itself. In 1798, Diego's wife received a letter from him that expressed with stark clarity his deteriorating psychological state. He wrote, "I am pursued by visions in this place. I see them not only in the depths of the basement, but in the corridors of the mansion itself, in the dining hall where my father entertained guests, in the library where I now spend my days reading about things that should not be read about. They do not come as demons, but as women and men, their faces marked by suffering. They speak in languages I cannot understand, but whose meaning is nonetheless clear. They call upon me for justice, for recognition, for some acknowledgement that their suffering was real, that their deaths were not inconsequential. I cannot provide them with these things. I cannot undo what has been done. I can only bear witness to their presence and feel the weight of that witnessing." Diego's death in 1802, at the age of 37, was officially attributed to a tropical fever. But contemporary accounts suggest something more complex. He was found dead in the library, in a chair facing directly toward the corridor that led to the stairway descending to the sealed basement chambers. There was no evidence of violence, but there was evidence of significant psychological disturbance. The walls of his room were marked with writings, apparently in his own hand, consisting of attempts to write the names of people whose names he apparently felt compelled to record, though the handwriting was so degraded and the names so imperfectly rendered that it was impossible to determine what he was attempting to accomplish. His son, Carlos Cipriano, inherited the hacienda at the age of 14. The young man who inherited a failing estate and the weight of family history was said by those who knew him to be exceptionally talented and intelligent, but also profoundly sensitive to spiritual and psychological matters in ways that appeared to exacerbate rather than resolve the problems facing the estate. Carlos's adolescence and early adulthood were marked by a series of illnesses that seemed psychological in nature, even though they manifested with very physical symptoms. Fevers without apparent organic cause, paralysis of limbs that would resolve when he was unconscious or distracted, but would return when he directed his conscious attention to them. Periods of profound depression during which he would remain confined to his chambers for weeks at a time, seeing no one, consuming minimal food. He did marry in 1820, at the urging of his extended family, who hoped that marriage and the responsibilities of a wife and the eventual production of heirs would provide him with the psychological grounding necessary to function effectively. The woman he married was Doña Beatriz Perez, the daughter of a significant colonial administrator. By all accounts, she was a woman of considerable character and intelligence, but she was also a woman who had entered into a marriage with a man whose psychological stability was fundamentally compromised. Beatriz's letters to her mother, written in the months following her marriage and preserved in private archives in Bogotá, reveal a woman attempting to understand and manage a situation that was rapidly exceeding her capabilities. She describes her husband's increasingly erratic behavior, his apparent terror regarding the basement chambers, and his conviction that the hacienda was inhabited by the spirits of the enslaved people who had died there. She also describes, with apparent concern, his growing conviction that his family had been specifically cursed for the sins committed by his grandfather, and that the curse would manifest through the destruction of the male line and the erasure of the family's fortune. "My husband speaks as though he is the instrument through which justice is being enacted," Beatrice wrote in one letter. "He does not resist this conviction, but rather seems to accept it as inevitable. I am deeply troubled by his state of mind, and I fear for his safety and for the future of our family." The isolation of the hacienda, remote as it was, contributed to the psychological deterioration. The communications with the outside world that had once flowed regularly, bringing news from Santa Fe and Cartagena and Seville, became increasingly infrequent. The once grand mansion, with its fine furnishings and artistic collections, began to fall into disrepair. Rooms were closed off. The staff, terrified by the atmosphere and the apparent instability of the master, began to flee at the first opportunity. By 1825, the hacienda was effectively abandoned by the elite families and administrators who had once made it a symbol of colonial wealth and power. The enslaved population, freed by Colombian independence in 1819 and the subsequent abolition of slavery, dispersed rapidly. The agricultural operations essentially ceased. The Cipriano family's fortune, which at its peak in 1760 had been estimated at over 4 million pesos, an extraordinary sum for that era, was depleted through a combination of mismanagement, the withdrawal of enslaved labor that had formed the foundation of the estate's wealth, and the psychological inability of successive generations to effectively manage what they had inherited. Carlos died in 1840, at the age of 52. He had fathered 3 children with Beatrice, but all 3 had died in infancy from causes that the physicians who attended them could not adequately explain. His last years were spent increasingly withdrawn, and there are accounts from servants who remained on the increasingly isolated estate that describe him spending nights in the sealed basement chambers, apparently attempting to communicate with the dead through rituals and practices that combined Christian prayer with elements that seemed drawn from African religious traditions. His death appears to have been suicide, though it was officially recorded as accidental. He was found at the bottom of a stairwell in the interior of the mansion. The official inquiry concluded that he had fallen, but the circumstances were such that virtually no one who examined them believed this explanation. The stairwell had railings. The pathway from his chambers would not logically have led him to that location in the darkness. It seemed far more likely that he had intentionally descended those stairs in darkness, seeking, perhaps, the lowest point within the mansion that would bring him closest to the sealed chambers below. With Carlos's death and the absence of male heirs, the 3 children with Beatrice having all predeceased him, the direct line of the Cipriano family came to an end. The hacienda passed to distant relatives in Spain, none of whom had any interest in maintaining or rehabilitating the property. By 1850, the mansion of the restless dead had become exactly that, a dead place, a location that generated no wealth, supported no operations, and served primarily as a repository for memories of cruelty, rebellion, and the slow erosion of a family's fortune and sanity. But the story does not end with abandonment. In fact, in a sense, it only begins. The hacienda remained largely abandoned through the latter half of the 19th century and the early decades of the 20th century. The building itself, constructed with exceptional solidity, resisted the ravages of time better than it might have otherwise. The thick stone walls, the quality construction, the isolation from urban development, all of these factors meant that the mansion did not rapidly decay, but rather persisted as a monument to a world that had passed away. It was in the 1950s that the hacienda began to attract serious scholarly and investigative attention. The Colombian government, in an effort to preserve significant historical sites, commissioned a survey of colonial-era properties of architectural or historical importance. The survey team that arrived at the Cipriano Hacienda in 1952 was composed of architects, historians, and restoration specialists. What they found was a building that was remarkably well preserved despite nearly a century of abandonment. The architectural survey was completed in 1954 and recommended that the hacienda be preserved as a historical monument. However, the restoration effort that followed revealed something unexpected. The building, despite its apparent structural soundness, seemed to resist habitation. Workers assigned to the restoration effort reported difficulties that ranged from the mundane, tools that would disappear and then reappear in unexpected locations, to the disturbing, workers experiencing unexplained feelings of dread and anxiety, instruments malfunctioning without apparent cause, and consistent reports of sounds emanating from the sealed basement chambers despite their apparent structural integrity and the removal of any potential sources of acoustic phenomena. One restoration team leader, an architect named Roberto Gomez, documented his experiences in a journal that was published posthumously. His early entries demonstrate professional objectivity and skepticism regarding the reports from workers. But as the restoration effort progressed, his tone shifted. By midway through the project, his journal entries reveal a man grappling with phenomena that resisted conventional explanation. One entry, dated June 1953, reads, "We have attempted multiple approaches to access the sealed basement chambers, seeking to understand the sounds that are persistently reported by workers. The chambers appear to be sealed with remarkable efficiency. We have located no cracks, no gaps, no apparent means by which sounds could penetrate from outside. And yet, the sounds continue. Today, I heard them myself. I stood in the corridor outside the sealed entrance for approximately 20 minutes. The sounds are not random. They seem to follow a pattern that could almost be described as musical, though it is music in no tradition I recognize. Some of the workers have suggested that the sounds might be in an African language or in an African musical tradition. If so, their presence in a sealed chamber that has been closed for nearly 2 centuries is a fact that challenges any rational explanation I can construct. A subsequent entry, dated August 1953, becomes more personal. I have been having difficulty sleeping in the mansion. Each night I experience dreams that feel far more vivid than normal dreams. Dreams in which I witness scenes of violence and suffering. I see enslaved people in chains. I see a man who I somehow understand is named Kwame, though I have not been told this name by anyone, and I encounter no one who provides me with this information. I see him resisting, fighting, dying. I wake from these dreams with a profound sense of sadness and guilt. These are not my memories, yet they feel as though they are. I do not know how to explain these experiences. The restoration effort was eventually abandoned in 1954. The official reason given was insufficient funding, but the journals and oral accounts from workers suggest that the abandonment was motivated by the conviction that the site itself was not amenable to restoration and rehabilitation. The hacienda remained largely inaccessible until the 1970s, when it was purchased by a private collector interested in colonial history. This owner, a wealthy Colombian businessman named Alejandro Fuentes, commissioned a new round of investigations and restoration efforts. Fuentes was fascinated by the historical record and skeptical regarding the supernatural claims. He hired engineers, historians, and a paranormal investigator named Dr. Hernan Lopez, who possessed a reputation for bringing rigorous scientific methodology to the investigation of unexplained phenomena. Dr. Lopez spent 3 months at the hacienda in 1975, conducting extensive investigations. His work involved recording equipment, photographic documentation, interviews with workers, and detailed examination of the physical structure of the building. His final report, which was published as a small monograph in 1977, represents perhaps the most detailed scientific examination of the hacienda's phenomena conducted to date. Lopez's findings were equivocal but significant. His recording equipment clearly documented sounds emanating from the sealed basement chambers, sounds that did not correspond to any known natural acoustic phenomena, and that seemed to vary in response to human presence and activities within the mansion. He recorded voices that, when analyzed spectrographically, appeared to contain patterns consistent with human speech, though the languages could not be immediately identified. He documented temperature variations in the sealed chambers that should not have been possible given the structural conditions. And he recorded multiple instances in which his sensitive optical equipment seemed to detect movement in the sealed chambers, despite the complete visual isolation created by the sealed doors and walls. Perhaps most significantly, Lopez documented something that previous investigators had noted but not emphasized. The phenomena appeared to intensify during periods associated with significant dates in the hacienda's history. On the anniversary of the rebellion, the date in November corresponding to Kwame's uprising, equipment sensitivity increased. On the dates corresponding to significant deaths within the Cipriano family, the intensity of the acoustic phenomena increased. Lopez concluded his report with an assessment that combined scientific caution with acknowledgement of the genuine difficulty of the phenomena. The hacienda represents a location in which established categories of physical understanding are challenged. Whatever is occurring within these spaces operates according to principles that do not fit comfortably within conventional scientific understanding. I cannot affirm that the phenomena is supernatural, as that term implies knowledge regarding what is natural and what exceeds nature, knowledge that I do not possess. I can affirm that the phenomena is real, that it is measurable, that it resists conventional explanation, and that any comprehensive model of physical reality must eventually account for the characteristics that this location manifests. Following Lopez's investigation, the hacienda acquired a reputation that extended beyond scholarly circles. It became known among paranormal researchers and occult enthusiasts as one of the most significant locations in Latin America where supernatural phenomena could be reliably documented and investigated. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the hacienda attracted a steady stream of researchers, psychic practitioners, and curiosity seekers. During this period, multiple attempts were made to cleanse the hacienda through rituals based on various traditions. A Jesuit priest attempted an exorcism in 1981, following procedures established by the Catholic Church for the removal of demonic presences. The ritual apparently had no effect on the phenomena. Various practitioners of African religious traditions attempted ceremonies designed to honor the dead and to facilitate their passage to the afterlife. These ceremonies seemed to have some effect. Workers reported that the ceremonies produced a temporary diminishment in the intensity of phenomena, but the effects never persisted. Within weeks of each cleansing attempt, the phenomena would reassert itself at or near its previous levels of intensity. In 1994, the hacienda was purchased by its current owner, a journalist and historian named Maria Isabel Santos. Santos established the hacienda as a research facility, creating the Cipriano Institute for the study of historical trauma and paranormal phenomena. This institute has conducted systematic investigations into the phenomena occurring within the hacienda, has compiled an extensive archive of historical documentation regarding the hacienda's history, and has worked toward preserving the site for both historical and scientific purposes. Under Santos's stewardship, The hacienda has been partially restored. Rooms have been reopened and furnished according to historical documentation regarding how they would have appeared during the hacienda's period of occupation. The library has been rehabilitated, and the historical documents preserved there have been catalogued and made available to researchers. The chapel has been restored and is now used for both Christian services and ceremonies from African religious traditions, honoring the spiritual practices that persisted among the enslaved people. Most significantly, Maria Isabel has made the decision not to unseal the basement chambers. Despite significant pressure from various researchers and curiosity seekers, she has maintained that the sealed chambers should remain sealed, both as a form of respect for the dead who perished there, and because the mechanisms that have allowed the phenomena to persist, whatever they might be, appear to be somehow associated with the sealed nature of these spaces. Opening them, she argues, might cause something to be released that cannot be recontained. Contemporary experiences of the hacienda are perhaps more complex and more varied than those documented in earlier eras. Individuals visiting or working at the site report phenomena that range from the subtle to the dramatic. Some report only vague impressions of unease or melancholy while in certain areas of the building. Others report more distinct experiences, seeing apparitions, hearing voices, experiencing sudden and intense emotional states that they cannot explain, and most notably, experiencing vivid dreams while sleeping within the building that seem to involve the witnessing of historical events related to the hacienda. One documented case involved a researcher named James Crawford, an American paranormal investigator who spent 2 weeks at the hacienda in 2003. Crawford reported that on the 4th night of his stay, he experienced an extraordinarily vivid dream in which he witnessed what he understood to be the final days of the 1765 rebellion. In the dream, he found himself in the perspective of a participant, apparently an enslaved person involved in the rebellion. He witnessed the military assault, the killing of Kwame, and the final scenes of destruction and death in the basement chambers. When Crawford awoke, he discovered that he had no knowledge of how these specific events had unfolded. Yet subsequent research into historical documentation confirmed that the sequence of events he had witnessed in the dream matched, with remarkable precision, the accounts preserved in colonial archives and in the oral traditions recorded from enslaved people and their descendants. Crawford reported that the experience had profoundly affected him, that witnessing, even in a dream state, the events that had transpired had given him a visceral understanding of the historical trauma that the hacienda represents. This phenomenon, the transmission of historical events through dreams experienced within the hacienda, has been reported by multiple visitors. Some researchers have theorized that this might represent a form of traumatic memory imprint encoded into the very structure of the building itself. Others have suggested that the phenomena might represent something more directly supernatural, the intervention of the spirits of the dead, attempting to ensure that their stories are not forgotten, that their suffering is acknowledged, that the truth of what occurred is preserved. In recent years, the hacienda has become recognized as perhaps the most significant historical and scientific resource for understanding the psychological impacts of slavery and colonial brutality. Educational groups visit the site regularly. Scholars conduct research in the archives. Artists have created works inspired by the hacienda's history. And at night, when the building settles into darkness, when the ordinary world seems to retreat somewhat from the physical space of the hacienda, the phenomena continue, inexplicable, persistent, and somehow serving the purpose of ensuring that the voices of those who suffered and died there are never entirely silenced. The sealed basement chambers remain closed, but their presence is felt constantly throughout the building. They are a reminder that history is not merely something that occurred in the past, isolated from the present. They are a reminder that some acts of cruelty create consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment, that acquire a kind of permanence in the places where they occurred, and that demand acknowledgement and reckoning. The Cipriano Hacienda has become a place where the boundary between past and present, between the historical and the contemporary, between the material and the spiritual, has become permeable. It is a place where the dead, in whatever form they take, seem to insist on being remembered. It is a place where the suffering inflicted through slavery has left imprints so profound that they seem to have altered the very nature of the location itself. What exactly is occurring in the sealed basement chambers? What explains the consistent phenomena documented across centuries? Are we witnessing the manifestation of supernatural presences, or are we witnessing something more subtle? The imprinting of human trauma into physical space, a phenomenon that operates according to principles of psychology and physics that we do not yet fully understand. These questions remain unanswered. But what is certain is that the Cipriano Hacienda, the mansion of the restless dead, continues to demand our attention, to insist upon the acknowledgement of historical truths, and to challenge our understanding of the boundaries between the possible and the impossible, between the explained and the unexplained. The dead do not rest, the mansion does not settle into silence, and the story, in its essential form, remains unresolved, a mystery that persists into the present day, a challenge to those who visit it to confront the realities of historical cruelty, to honor those who suffered, and to remain open to possibilities that exceed our conventional understanding of how the world works. Your engagement with this story matters profoundly. The history of the Cipriano Hacienda is not merely an account of the past. It is a story about how human cruelty creates consequences that persist, about how the voices of the oppressed demand to be heard, about how history itself seems to resist being forgotten or erased. I invite your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe is truly occurring within the sealed chambers of the Hacienda? Do you find the supernatural explanations compelling, or do you believe the phenomena can be accounted for through psychological or scientific principles? Have you experienced anything in your own life that challenged your understanding of what is possible? Please share your insights and engage with others who are wrestling with these same profound questions. Subscribe to our channel to ensure that you do not miss our next investigation. We are about to embark on a series exploring other locations throughout Latin America where the past seems to resist remaining in the past, where history itself seems to manifest in ways that challenge conventional understanding. Our recommended next video awaits you. A documentary investigation into the floating island communities of Lake Titicaca, where indigenous traditions have persisted for centuries despite colonial and contemporary pressures, and where the boundary between the spiritual and the material remains remarkably permeable. We believe you will find it as compelling and as thought-provoking as the story you have just experienced. Thank you for witnessing this history with us. Thank you for taking the time to engage with a story that demands that we confront difficult realities about our shared past. And thank you for remaining open to possibilities that exceed conventional understanding. The dead are acknowledged, the mansions are remembered, and the search for truth continues.